Please, don't make me take off my clothes, she whispered, but the cold millionaire did it anyway. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main characters. James Hawk was a man who never let anything slip through his control. Cold, calculating, and ruthless in every way, he was the kind of person who took what he wanted, whether it was a business deal or the people in his life. At 39, he had built an empire, making his billions from companies that thrived on precision, timing, and sheer power. His reputation was one of unwavering confidence, and to most, he seemed unreachable. Yet, even a man like James could find himself intrigued by someone like Claire Monroe. Claire was everything he wasn't: warm, compassionate, and undeniably fragile in the world he had mastered. She had entered his life by chance, invited to one of his lavish charity events, a world she didn't quite belong in. James noticed her the moment she walked into the room, graceful, yet out of place among the polished, corporate crowd. Claire didn't know much about James beyond his public persona, but she knew he was dangerous, not in the typical sense, but in the way he could make people feel small, insignificant. Her heart pounded when their eyes first met, but she quickly looked away. She wasn't sure why she felt nervous, but there was something about him, something commanding, that made her pulse quicken. When their paths crossed later that evening, James made his move. "I'm James," he said in that unmistakable, authoritative tone. Claire didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, offering a nervous smile. "You seem out of place here," he added, his gaze scanning her as though he could see right through her. Claire's stomach tightened. "I'm not really used to events like this," she replied, her voice soft. "I'm sure you'll fit in just fine," James said, his tone smooth, almost mocking, as if he already had her figured out. His words left her unsettled, but there was a part of her, a small part, that was curious. The night wore on, and they found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the event, away from the crowd. Claire felt the pressure of his gaze, the heat of his presence. He was towering, imposing, but she couldn't help but feel drawn to him, even though she knew she should be cautious. "Please, don't make me take off my clothes," she whispered, almost under her breath. The words were out before she could stop them, a reaction to the tension that had been building between them, an unspoken pull she couldn't resist. James didn't flinch. He didn't soften. He simply stared at her, as if considering her words. Then, slowly, without a word, he took a step closer. Claire's breath hitched, her heart racing as she realized just how much power he had over her. "I'm sure you'll fit in just fine," James had said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Claire could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like he was studying her every move, every word. Her heart was pounding in her chest as the evening wore on, but she tried to shake off the feeling that something about him, about this whole situation, was just a little too much. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in a room full of powerful people like James. He was the kind of man who made everyone else around him seem smaller, less significant. The kind of man who always got what he wanted. She wasn't sure why she felt both repelled and drawn to him at the same time. It didn't make sense. Claire had never been the type to fall for someone so quickly, especially not someone so intimidating. But there was something about James that made her feel like she was on the edge of something dangerous, yet somehow thrilling. As the night continued, they found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the event. The music from the main room echoed faintly in the background, but here, in this secluded space, it was just the two of them. James's presence was almost overwhelming. He stood a few feet away, his posture straight, his arms crossed, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. Claire shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. "You're very different from the women I usually meet at these kinds of events," James said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Claire wasn't sure how to respond. She wasn't used to being analyzed so openly. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice betraying the uncertainty she felt. "You're not like them," he repeated, stepping closer. Claire's breath hitched as she instinctively took a step back. But James didn't stop. He took another step forward, closing the gap between them. You're not here for the fame or the money, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. You're different. His words sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't know whether to feel flattered or frightened. I'm just trying to survive, Claire finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. James raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her response. Trying to survive? He echoed, his tone almost teasing. What does that mean? Claire looked down at the floor, feeling suddenly vulnerable. I didn't grow up in this world. I don't belong in places like this, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. James was silent for a moment, as if considering her words. Then, with a slight smirk, he reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. Everyone belongs here, Claire, he said softly. Especially you. She froze under his touch, not knowing what to make of his words. There was something in his voice, something that made her feel both exposed and strangely safe. Don't be so hard on yourself, James continued. You've got more strength than you realize. His words caught her off guard. She had never thought of herself as particularly strong. She was just a woman trying to make her way in a world that often felt too big, too intimidating. I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I'm not like you. I don't have the confidence you do. James's expression softened, just for a moment. Confidence isn't something you're born with, he said quietly. It's something you build. Claire was taken aback by his sincerity. For a moment, she saw something in him that she hadn't before. Something beyond the cold, calculating billionaire persona he wore so well. Something human. But just as quickly as it appeared, that vulnerability disappeared behind his usual composed exterior. He took a step back, breaking the connection between them. We all have our masks, Claire, he said, his voice returning to its usual cool tone. Mine is just a little more polished than most. Claire nodded, still trying to process everything that had just happened. She wasn't sure what to make of James anymore. Was he just playing with her? Or was there something real beneath all the power and wealth? She didn't know. But for the first time that night, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could take a chance on him. Or at least, on whatever this was between them. As the evening wore on, Claire found herself thinking about James more and more. The way he had looked at her, the way his words had made her feel alive, seen, and even understood. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself get too close to him, but something inside her told her that this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. I had no idea what was happening. For weeks after that night, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed some sort of line. She'd seen James in the same light she saw every successful man, cold, distant, and unyielding. But he was different. He'd made her feel things she hadn't expected, things she didn't know how to handle. They hadn't spoken much since that night at the charity event, but there was an unspoken tension between them. It was like there was something hovering in the air, something she couldn't quite name, but she knew it was there. It wasn't just attraction, though she'd felt that too. It was something deeper, more complicated. When James called her out of the blue one afternoon, Claire almost didn't answer. But she couldn't ignore him. Something inside her pulled her to the phone, as though she was compelled to hear his voice again. Claire. His deep voice resonated through the speaker, smooth and commanding as always. I need you to come to the office. There's something I need to discuss with you. The directness of his tone left no room for refusal. Claire hesitated, but something told her that refusing him would be a mistake. She told herself she was only going to go because it was business. Nothing more. But even as she said that, she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't sure what it was, but something inside her had already decided she couldn't stay away from him forever. The drive to his office felt longer than usual. She couldn't help but wonder what he wanted. They hadn't been in close contact since the event. She'd seen him at a couple of other gatherings, but their interactions had been brief, almost formal. Still, every time she looked into his eyes, that same intensity was there, lingering just beneath the surface. When she arrived, James was waiting for her. He was standing by the large window in his office, looking out over the city with his usual air of authority. The moment he turned to face her, Claire's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't changed. Still impossibly handsome, still wearing that ever-present mask of control. I didn't expect you to come, James said, his voice as cool as ever, but there was something different in his eyes. Something more personal. I didn't think you'd ask, Claire replied, trying to keep her tone casual, but it came out softer than she intended. James walked over to the desk and gestured for her to sit. As she took her seat, she noticed the papers scattered across the desk, documents, reports, and a few that looked like blueprints. "I need you to help me with something," he said, his voice steady. "It's business, but I trust you'll be able to handle it." Claire raised an eyebrow. "You trust me?" she asked, skeptical. James's lips curved into a brief smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I do," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've been watching you, Claire. You're smarter than most people give you credit for." The compliment was unexpected, and it threw her off balance. She wasn't sure what to make of it. "I'm flattered," she said, unsure of how to respond. "But what exactly do you need help with?" James didn't waste any time. He handed her the blueprints, explaining a business venture he was working on, a project so complex it required someone with a fresh perspective. Claire studied the documents, trying to keep her thoughts focused. But every time she glanced up at James, there was that same tension in the air between them. Something unsaid. Something that made her feel both nervous and strangely alive. After a few minutes, she put the papers down and looked at him. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice quiet. "I'm not like you, James. I don't have your confidence, your ability to make things happen." James took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Confidence is a choice, Claire," he said, his voice low. "It's about deciding what you want and going after it. The rest is just noise." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire wasn't sure what he was really trying to say, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever this was between them, it was only going to get more complicated from here. "I've never met anyone quite like you, Claire," James said, his voice steady but with a certain weight behind it. Claire could hear the faintest trace of something in his words, something she couldn't quite place. They had spent hours going over the project, but she couldn't stop thinking about the moment when their conversation had shifted, when it had become more than just business. She could feel the tension in the air, the pull between them growing stronger with each passing minute. She had tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the blueprints in front of her, but every time she looked up at James, the world seemed to shift. He was different today, more attentive, more focused on her than ever before. "I don't know what you mean," Claire replied, her voice soft, unsure of how to handle his sudden shift in tone. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're not like anyone else," he said, his words almost a whisper, as if he was revealing something vulnerable. "You don't play the games everyone else plays. You're not here to win approval. You're just yourself." Claire shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. She had never been good at handling compliments, especially from someone like James. "I'm just trying to make a living," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I'm not here to impress anyone." James's eyes softened slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. "That's what I admire about you," he said, almost as if he was speaking more to himself than to her. "You're real. You don't try to hide behind masks like everyone else." Claire felt a strange knot form in her stomach. She wasn't sure if she was flattered or uneasy, but something in his words struck a chord with her. She had always prided herself on being genuine, on not pretending to be someone she wasn't. But with James, it was hard to keep that same sense of certainty. There was something about him that made her second-guess everything she thought she knew about herself. "I don't think I'm anything special," she said, her voice shaky, betraying her uncertainty. James didn't reply right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to the large window that overlooked the city. Claire watched him, her heart pounding in her chest. The way he carried himself, so self-assured, so in control, made her feel like she was standing at the edge of something unknown. "You are special," he said, turning to face her, his eyes dark and intense. "You just don't realize it yet." Claire swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," she said, gesturing to the papers on the desk. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this project." James walked back toward her, his steps deliberate, each one calculated. "You are," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "You just need to trust yourself." She met his gaze, the intensity in his eyes almost overwhelming. For a moment, she felt like the world around them had stopped. There was nothing but the two of them, standing in this quiet room, and yet everything was so loud. Claire's heart raced as she tried to gather her thoughts. She wanted to believe him, to trust that she could be the person he thought she could be. But something held her back. She had always been cautious, always kept her guard up. She didn't know how to let that go. I don't know if I can, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. James stepped closer to her, his presence impossible to ignore. You can, he said, his voice low, almost like a command. You just have to believe in yourself. Believe in what you're capable of. Claire felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, a mix of warmth and pressure. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step into the unknown with him, but the way he looked at her made her feel like she could do anything. I'll try, she said, her voice steadying. James's expression softened just a fraction, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. That's all I ask, he replied. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she had a choice in her life, like she could shape her own future, no matter how uncertain it might be. The next few days were a blur. Claire dove into the project with a renewed sense of purpose, trusting in James's words more than she ever thought she would. Every time she stumbled, every time she questioned her abilities, she remembered his voice, telling her to believe in herself. It wasn't easy, but with each passing day, she found herself becoming more confident in her decisions, in her ability to contribute. And all the while, James was there, quiet, steady, always watching, always guiding. She didn't know what this was between them, but she couldn't ignore the way it made her feel. Something was changing. And maybe, just maybe, it was something worth exploring. I still remember the first time Claire felt like she was truly making progress. Weeks had passed since she'd begun working more closely with James, and while the project was demanding, something about it felt right. She was beginning to trust her instincts, taking on more responsibility and making decisions that surprised even herself. There were moments, though, when she found herself pausing, moments when James's presence in the room made everything else fade into the background. He had a way of looking at her, of guiding her without saying a word, that made her feel seen in a way no one ever had. She still wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was a growing part of her that was starting to lean into it. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting, James invited her to stay afterward. I need to go over a few more things with you, he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. Claire nodded, trying to hide the flutter in her chest. She wasn't sure why she felt so nervous around him, but it had been happening more and more. James was just so intense. She had learned to read the subtle changes in his expression, the way his eyes would shift when he was deep in thought, but his gaze still held that unrelenting focus. It was like he could see into her, beyond the professional exterior she tried to maintain. She couldn't quite figure out if it was something to be afraid of or something to be embraced. So, James began once they were alone in his office. How do you think we're doing? He was still standing by the window, his hands behind his back, his eyes on the horizon. It wasn't a question Claire expected, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to answer. I think we're making good progress, she said, her voice steady. I've learned a lot from you. She glanced up, catching his eyes for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something that made her feel like he wasn't just talking about the project anymore. James turned to face her, taking a few steps closer. I'm glad you're learning, he said, his voice low. But you're capable of so much more than you think. Claire swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. I'm just doing my job, she said, trying to downplay the significance of it all. James shook his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. It's not just about the job. It's about your potential. I see something in you, Claire. His words hit her like a wave, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to react. It wasn't just a compliment. There was an intensity in his voice, a conviction that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James took another step closer, his presence overwhelming. I mean that you have the ability to do things that others can't even imagine. You're capable of leading, Claire, of making decisions that will change everything. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing things like that. Not about herself. I've never thought of myself that way, she admitted, feeling a vulnerability she hadn't expected to share. You should, he said softly. You have what it takes. I see it in you. She wasn't sure what to say. She had always been so cautious, so hesitant to step into a role that demanded confidence and strength. But the way James was looking at her, the way he believed in her, it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she could be that person. It felt like stepping into a new reality, One where she was more than just an assistant, more than just someone who was trying to get by. She could feel the shift inside her, like a switch being flipped. But it wasn't just the project that was changing her, it was everything. James's presence, his quiet encouragement, was starting to seep into every part of her life. She was beginning to see herself differently. And even though she was still uncertain, still trying to find her footing, she couldn't deny the way he made her feel. It was like she was on the verge of something huge, something that was both exciting and terrifying. "I'll try," she said, finally, her voice steady but with a hint of something new in it. James smiled, a small, knowing smile. "That's all I ask." And for the first time, Claire wasn't afraid of what was ahead. She was ready to step into the unknown, to see where this path with James would take her. Maybe it was time for her to start believing in herself the way he believed in her. "I've never been one for taking risks," Claire thought to herself as she stared out of the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. It had been a few weeks since that pivotal moment in James's office, and in that time, things between them had only grown more complicated. The project was coming together well, but it wasn't just the work that had her heart racing. It was James. She found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. There was an intensity in his presence, a confidence that was both attractive and intimidating. Every time they spoke, every time they shared a moment of conversation, she could feel the pull between them growing stronger. But she couldn't ignore the fear that lingered in the back of her mind. Fear of what it meant. Fear of what it would do to her. Claire had always played it safe. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions in check, to protect herself from the kind of vulnerability that James seemed to evoke so effortlessly. But lately, it had become harder and harder to ignore the way he made her feel. It wasn't just admiration for his success or respect for his brilliance. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. She had been keeping her distance, but she couldn't deny that the line between professional and personal was blurring. More and more with each passing day. That afternoon, Claire was wrapping up some work when James unexpectedly appeared at her desk. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone serious, yet there was an underlying warmth in his voice that made her heart skip a beat. She looked up, surprised. "Of course," she replied, her voice betraying a hint of nervousness. James gestured for her to join him. "Let's go for a walk," he said. They made their way out of the office, down the hallway, and out into the cool evening air. It was quiet, the city streets empty, save for the soft hum of traffic in the distance. Claire tried to steady her nerves, but there was something about the way James was looking at her that made her feel exposed. "I've been thinking about you," James began, his voice low. "About us." The words hung in the air between them, and Claire's heart began to race. She had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. "James," she started, but he stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "You don't need to say anything. Just listen." His words were commanding, but there was a softness to them that made her want to listen. She could feel the heat rising between them as they walked, but she didn't know how to respond. He had always been so in control, so certain of what he wanted, but this felt different. "I don't know what it is about you, Claire," James continued, his voice softer now, "but I can't ignore it anymore. I can't pretend that there isn't something between us." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this conversation, but a part of her knew it was inevitable. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James stopped walking, turning to face her. "I'm saying that I've never met anyone like you. Not someone who challenges me the way you do. Not someone who makes me think, makes me question what I want." Claire felt her pulse quicken as his words sank in. She had always known James was different, but she never imagined he would feel this way about her. She had tried to keep her emotions at bay, but now, standing here with him, everything felt overwhelming. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for it." James took a step closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't have to be ready," he said quietly. "I just need you to know that I see you. All of you. And I don't want to walk away from this. Not now, not ever." Claire's heart was racing now, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, looking up at him, trying to process everything he had just said. "James, she started, but once again, he silenced her with a gentle touch to her arm. "You don't have to say anything yet," he said softly. "Just know that I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you want me to." Claire stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear: everything between them had changed. She couldn't deny it anymore. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for her to stop holding back. Time to let herself take a chance. Time to see where this would lead. The days following that conversation with James felt different. Claire tried to carry on with the project, burying herself in the work to keep her mind from wandering. But every time she looked up from the papers, every time she caught a glimpse of James across the room, something inside her shifted. She couldn't ignore the pull between them any longer. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. It was the way he made her feel, like she was more than just an employee, more than just a colleague. There was a connection between them that neither of them could deny, though neither knew how to approach it. The tension was thick, almost tangible. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyscrapers, casting a golden glow over the office, Claire found herself alone with James again. He had called her into his office, asking for a quick update on the project. She tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to their last conversation. James's words kept echoing in her head. "I see you. All of you." His presence in the room had a way of overwhelming her, making her heart race even when he said nothing at all. He was sitting behind his desk, flipping through a few papers, but when she entered, his eyes lifted, and he gave her that look again. That look that made her feel like she was the only one in the room. "How's the progress going?" he asked, his tone casual, though there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't asking about the project. Claire swallowed, trying to calm the fluttering in her chest. "It's going well. We're almost there," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "Good," James said, leaning back in his chair. He studied her for a moment, his gaze never leaving her face. Claire tried to keep her composure, but she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. The silence stretched between them, heavy and filled with unspoken words. Finally, James spoke again. "I need to know something, Claire," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Do you trust me?" The question hung in the air, and Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to answer. Trust was something she had always struggled with, something she had learned to guard over the years. But there was something about James that made her want to believe in him. He wasn't like anyone else she had ever met. I think I do," she said slowly, her voice betraying her uncertainty. James nodded, as though he had expected that answer. "Good," he said, his voice softening. "Because there's more to this than just the work." Claire frowned, her mind racing. What did he mean? More than just the work? She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever he was about to say, but she couldn't bring herself to stop him either. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of her. He was close now, too close, and the air between them seemed to thicken with each step he took. "I mean that I see more in you than just your skills, Claire," he said, his voice barely audible. "I see someone who is capable of more than she thinks. Someone who doesn't have to hide behind walls." Claire's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he was trying to say, but it felt like a turning point, like everything was leading to this moment. She had always kept her emotions locked away, always kept her guard up. But now, standing here with James, that guard was starting to slip. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm not like you. I don't know how to open up like you do." James's expression softened, and for the first time in a long time, Claire saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "You don't have to be like me," he said gently. "You just need to trust yourself." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had been so afraid of trusting, so afraid of letting someone in. But in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go. Time to take a chance. "I don't know what this is between us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm willing to find out." James smiled then, a small, knowing smile that made her heart skip a beat. "That's all I need to hear," he said softly. And in that moment, Claire knew that whatever happened next, she wasn't alone. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, piece by piece, and she wasn't afraid to face whatever came next. James had shown her something she didn't know she needed, someone who believed in her, who saw her not as just an employee, but as someone capable of more. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to believe it too. As the days passed, Claire felt a strange shift within herself. The walls she had spent years building up were starting to fall, piece by piece. It was subtle at first, small changes in the way she carried herself, the way she interacted with James, with others, but it was there, undeniable. She was becoming someone different, someone she hadn't expected to be. It was as if James had unlocked a door within her that she didn't even know existed. The work they were doing together was progressing rapidly. The project was nearing its final stages, and Claire felt a sense of accomplishment each time they made a breakthrough. But it wasn't just the work that had her heart racing. It was the growing connection between her and James. They had spent more time together recently, and every time they did, Claire found herself drawn closer to him. There were moments when their conversations drifted away from business, moments when they simply talked, as if they were two people who had known each other for years. It was in those moments that Claire felt something shift, something she didn't have the words for. James was unlike anyone she had ever met. His presence was commanding, his confidence unwavering. But there was something else about him that kept drawing her in, a quiet depth, an unspoken understanding. It was as though he saw right through her, but not in a way that made her feel exposed. He saw her strengths, her potential, and he encouraged her to embrace them. That afternoon, as they were wrapping up the final details of their project, James asked Claire to stay a little longer. The office was nearly empty, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the space with a low, comforting sound. James was at his desk, reviewing the last of the reports, but Claire could feel his eyes on her as she worked. She glanced up and caught his gaze, and for a moment, everything around them seemed to fade away. "Claire," James said softly, breaking the silence. "Come here." His voice was calm, but there was a certain intensity in it that made her heart skip a beat. She stood up, walking over to him, her steps slow but purposeful. When she reached his side, he handed her a folder filled with the final drafts of their project. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low, his gaze lingering on her. Claire took the folder from him, but she didn't immediately look at the papers inside. She was too aware of the distance between them, of the way the air seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension. "James, she started to speak, but he stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. "Just listen," he said softly. "You've done something amazing here, Claire. I don't think you even realize how much you've grown, how much you've accomplished." His words caught her off guard. She hadn't expected to hear him say that. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to keep the emotion out of her voice. "You're doing more than that," James said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're becoming someone who is capable of anything. You've got the confidence now, the drive. You're not just the woman who used to hide behind her doubts. You're someone who stands on her own." Claire's heart raced as she processed his words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to accept that, to believe it, but there was a part of her that knew he was right. She had come so far. She had changed, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to acknowledge that. "James, she started, but he reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I know what you're thinking. You're afraid of what comes next, afraid of what this means." Claire nodded, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her. She was afraid. She had always been afraid. Afraid of taking risks, afraid of trusting, afraid of the unknown. But with James, things felt different. It felt like the ground beneath her was steady for the first time in a long time. "I'm not asking you to make any big decisions right now," James continued, his voice soothing. "I just want you to know that I see you. All of you. And I'm not going anywhere." His words settled into her chest like a warm embrace, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like maybe, just maybe, she could stop being afraid. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. James smiled, a small but genuine smile that made her heart flutter. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "This is all you, Claire. You've earned this." For a long moment, they stood there, the quiet of the room enveloping them, the city outside still buzzing with life. Claire felt a shift inside her, a sense of peace, of possibility. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face it. And that, she realized, was all because of James. She wasn't just his colleague anymore. She was someone who had found her voice, who had discovered her strength. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to see where this path would take her. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work and quiet moments. Claire found herself growing more confident with each passing day. The project was nearly finished, and James had been more supportive than ever, giving her the space to make decisions, while always being there when she needed guidance. But the tension between them had not gone away. In fact, it had only grown stronger. There were moments when their hands brushed, when their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the entire world seemed to pause. Claire could no longer deny the attraction she felt for him. It was undeniable. Yet, there was still a part of her that held back, unsure of what it meant. Was this just a professional connection? Or was it something more? One late afternoon, as Claire was preparing to leave for the day, she found herself once again in James's office. The city outside had darkened, and the office was illuminated only by the soft glow of the desk lamp. She had come in to finalize a few details, but as always, there was something about James's presence that made the air between them feel electric. "You're still here," James said, his voice soft as he looked up from his work. Claire glanced at the clock. "I just wanted to finish a few things," she replied, though she knew deep down she wasn't quite ready to leave just yet. James smiled slightly and pushed back from his desk, standing up to walk over to where she was sitting. "I don't mind," he said, his voice low, but there was a warmth in it that made Claire's heart skip a beat. She glanced up at him, noticing how close he was now. It was as if he could sense the uncertainty in her. The space between them seemed to shrink, the quiet tension growing thicker. "James, Claire started, but her words faltered. She had thought about this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was finally here, she wasn't sure what to say. James seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to say anything, Claire," he said softly, his hand gently resting on the back of her chair. "I know what you're feeling." His words were so calm, so certain, that Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. "You do?" she whispered, still unsure of how to navigate the emotions swirling within her. "I do," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "You've been holding back for so long, afraid of what might happen if you let go. But it's okay. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Claire's heart raced as she absorbed his words. She had always kept a part of herself guarded, never allowing anyone to get too close, afraid of what it might mean if she let her walls down. But with James, things were different. He wasn't like anyone else. He didn't make her feel small or insignificant. He made her feel seen, heard, like her thoughts and feelings mattered. "I'm scared," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of what this could mean. Scared of what might happen between us." James took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the most comforting way. "It's okay to be scared," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But don't let that fear hold you back. You deserve more than to live in fear of what might happen. You deserve to take a chance on yourself, on us." Claire looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity. He wasn't asking for anything more than for her to trust him, to trust herself. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, her heart torn between wanting to believe in what James was saying and the fear of letting herself fall. James's gaze softened, and he crouched down in front of her, so they were eye level. "You don't have to be ready. You just have to take that first step," he said, his voice gentle, yet full of conviction. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Claire." Her chest tightened as she looked into his eyes, her mind racing. She had spent so much of her life holding back, keeping people at arm's length, protecting herself from the possibility of getting hurt. But now, with James, it felt different. It felt safe. It felt right. For the first time, Claire realized she didn't need to be afraid. Maybe it was time to take a chance, to let herself be vulnerable, to let herself trust again. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady as she met his gaze. "I'm ready to see where this goes." A smile spread across James's face, and for a moment, everything else faded away. There was just the two of them, standing in that quiet office, the future wide open before them. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be.